Good morning. Thank you for joining this session. The session is entitled ART, a Revolutionary Tool, Genealogy of Global Black Arts Movements. My name is Lasana Kazembe. I'm an assistant professor at Indianapolis University in Indianapolis, Indiana. This presentation examines the literature, the visual culture, the audio politics, aesthetic foundations, and political thrusts of six 20th century global Black arts movements. As counter movements against imperialism, these global Black arts movements emerged as fugitive spaces for cultural autonomy, empowerment, remembering, and Pan-African solidarity. The presentation will situate Black art as ART, a revolutionary tool for radical social and cultural transformation, for principled truth-telling and edutainment, and of course, human liberation. Within this framework of cultural remembering and reinscribing, the Elevate program emerged. This curriculum intervention situates global Black arts movements as a counter narrative to reclaim and teach a usable past and to develop students' cultural, aesthetic, and critical media literacies. So Elevate is an exploration of six 20th century global Black arts movements, looking at the Indigiste movement, the Negritude movement, the Negrismo movement, the New Negro movement / Harlem Renaissance, the Black Chicago Renaissance, and the Black arts movement. So when we talk about Black art and the Black aesthetic, I define it along with Wadsworth Jarrell, a major BAM artist, defined as a lexicon of philosophical constructs that emanates from a philosophy consciously subscribing to Africana approaches to making art. When I talk about the global Black art movement, its literature and its ideology, we're looking at the evolution of that literature, how it evolved within a context of colonization as a response, if you will, to the colonial situation, but also as a quest for a new affirmation and a new orientation in the world. So our literature, if you trace back across those six 20th century movements, you can find that it is born out of a context of subordination in the Western Hemisphere. And of course, from that subordination would attempt to alienate us from our language, our mores, our folkways, our norms, our religion, our customs, our history, our names, our deities. So with that alienation, when the human response to that is, of course, revolt. And that we did all over the Western world, the world of where we experienced cultural imperialism, European imperialism, white supremacy, et cetera, came the revolt. After the revolt, or alongside the revolt, comes again a quest for self-affirmation. So this history and this culture, this foreign culture that we've been impacted by is telling us we're not beautiful. And the first thing that oppressed people want to proclaim is that they are beautiful. And then they want to go about seeking a rediscovery, which leads to the next path, a rediscovery of one's origins, of one's roots, of who one is and who we are and whose we are. And of course, that is going to naturally lead us toward a path of independence, not just physical independence, but also ideological and psychocultural independence. So the global Black arts movements, when we look at their roots, they came essentially, were born of two thrusts. One was this psychological response to the social and cultural conditions of the colonial situation that African people in Haiti and African people in Cuba and Puerto Rico, African people all over the Caribbean were experiencing. And the second part of that, however, is a quest for a new and an original orientation and expression in the world. So we're not French, we're not Spanish, we're not Portuguese, and we're also not indigenous Taino and indigenous Arawak. So we are transplanted Africans. And what we find when we look at the roots of the global Black arts movements is a continuity of, in terms of wanting to pursue an exploration of one's origins, this indigenousness, nativeness, rootedness, Blackness. And that's what emerged in these global Black arts movements. So when you look at them, we find that they consisted of a serious and a deep rooted and a wide and expansive intellectual genealogy. By that, we're talking about its epistemological frameworks and its thought modes, its rhetorical tradition, its historical experiences, its collective memory and remembrance, and its accumulated folk knowledge, all of the things that make a people a people. Flowing again from that is an artistic genealogy. That is its poetry, its poetics, its poets, its essayists, its other literature forms such as its plays and its stories, its lessons, its didactic lessons, its moral tales and mythologies. Also the visual art that emerged out of this artistic genealogy, the paintings, the sculpture, of course, the institution building. And of course, this tradition that Dr. Joyce King talks about called eldering. So we know that these ancestors of ours who are departed ancestors are very much alive in the consciousness and very much connected and on scene in terms of guiding us with the work that we're doing today. So all of these things existed as an intellectual genealogy and an artistic genealogy that these artists of these 6 global Black arts movements were actually trying to reacquire, to reclaim, to apprehend, and then to turn them and use them in terms of what I call a usable past. So within this scholarship, there's 3 interrelated zones that sort of drive and fuel the scholarship. One is a Pan-African Black intellectual tradition. All right. And the second one is education for liberation. I am a professor of education and Africana studies. So when I teach, I train people who want to become teachers. And so we are not just training them in a neutral fashion, but we're training them in terms of seeking and developing education and utilizing education for liberation, to free the mind. And of course, arts learning and pedagogy, that is the third leg that sort of fuels my interest in this topic area of global Black arts movements. Within the Africana Black intellectual tradition, we have a series of branches that stem out of that, the Jegna tradition and Maroonage, this tradition of Black educational excellence that we have, and the Jali of male youth development, Africana theorizing methodology and praxis. Within arts learning, again, comes this inquiry around global Black arts movements, my use of ART, a revolutionary tool, and of course, the culturally sustaining arts pedagogy, culture circles, literacy, and literary communities of practice that emerge within school spaces where I work. And then out of the educational thrust comes this quest, education for liberation. And out of this comes these traditions of culturally responsive teaching, the theorizing and practice around culturally sustaining pedagogy, reflective teaching, our Black curriculum orientations throughout the US and the Caribbean. And of course, dismantling whiteness, white supremacy, and all forms of hegemony and hierarchy in education. So those are the 3 thrusts that sort of guide the work. Out of those works also comes this theoretical framework that I conceptualized, and one has to do with Black arts aesthetic critical literacy. This is where I look as a practitioner of this curriculum. I'm looking for openings in the curriculum that can enable me to explore alternative ways that we can value knowledge, that we can structure thinking and inquiry and practices around African-American cultural knowledge and folk traditions. Again, a second aspect of this is Black arts inquiry. This is a philosophical enterprise that analyzes and synthesizes Black arts cultural production, including its artist activists, its origins and antecedents, its poetics, its history, etc. And then, of course, the Black arts aesthetic philosophy and poetics. And that gives us a vision for an alternative curricular paradigm that leverages the Africana cultural memory. We're talking Nomo, the power of the spoken word, the griot or the Jali, and the Sankofa, our cultural memory. All of these things are shaped with respect for the artistic and political goals of global Black arts movements. So with the curriculum itself, which is called Elevate, again, an exploration of these 20th century global Black arts movements, it's a literacy or literary and creative arts initiative introducing students to the culture, history, and political impact of these movements. Indígena movement in Haiti during the 1920s, the Negrismo movement in Cuba and Puerto Rico, 1920s and 30s, the Negritude movement in Paris and French Guiana, Senegal in the 1930s, New Negro movement / Harlem Renaissance, 1917, 1933. And when it met its nadir comes the rise of the Black Chicago Renaissance in 1935, 1950. And of course, the Black Arts Movement, 1965, 1975. A seventh one you could add would be the hip hop movement, which arose almost coterminous with the Black Arts Movement. But with these six that we're looking at, I'm looking at the song, the art, the music, the dance, the drum, the culture, the poetry, the sculpture, the poetics, all of the art, the expressive art, as well as the material art that emerged out of these movements, and using them as a tool, as a curricular tool and an intervention. So some of the desired learning outcomes for students include exploring these six global Black arts movements and the artist activists that made them, that brought them about, but also the cultural and political foundations and impulses, because all six of these movements have so much in common. One thing they have in common is that they were all driven by a political thrust. There would be no Indígena movement emerging in Haiti, but for the fact that the United States military invaded Haiti in 1917. So we see always a political thrust, a political driver that brings about an artistic, a radical and revolutionary artistic response. Of course, also students who learn about these movements learn about what I call geoliteracy, that is locating places and spaces on the planet, making connections between Lisbon, Portugal, and Cuba, and Brazil, and New York, making these connections so that we can shore up that geography learning gap that exists, especially among US students. Of course, we're studying also the visual and performing art that developed and it was performed and disseminated across each of these movements. And then, of course, understanding that double thrust that we were talking about, using, looking at art and, as a psychological response to colonialism. You can add racism, white supremacy to that. And then, but also looking at it, getting beyond the analysis of domination and looking at it as a quest for a new and original orientation in the world so that African people can speak their special cultural truths to the world. Additional learning outcomes that students learn about in the program are the historical, political, and cultural interconnections that emerged and flourished between the US, Africa, Caribbean, and Europe during the 20th century. So the great man at the top, Langston Hughes, was essentially the gadfly who brought together so many Africana artists from all over Cuba and Puerto Rico and Haiti, introduced their works to audiences in the US and vice versa via his anthologizing of poets and writers. Also students, this is a workshop, so students will actually learn how to write in the poetic form, how to edit poetry, critique poetry, essays, and also they're creating visual content. So they're creating art and critiquing art, learning about the 4 forms of art criticism. And of course, these students are learning how to work and learn and collaborate within a creative learning community. So we're looking at an analysis of the visual culture that emerged during these global Black arts movement. We're looking also at what I call the audio politics or the sonic culture, the music that emerged out of these global Black arts movements, and looking at the messages in that music, both in terms of form and content, in terms of style and substance. And then again, we're looking at the literature of these movements. So we're going deep into the corpus of Africana history, Africana culture, and we're pulling out the grandmasters who put and documented our works so that students can be introduced to this history, they can be introduced to this culture, and they can again use it or utilize it as in terms of what I call a usable past. So one branch that's coming up in this work as I continue to investigate it and interrogate it is looking at this as a maroon space. So this is a branch thought and a branch of inquiry that's emerging out of my work in the Elevate program and Maroon Spaces, looking at them as also spaces in which we develop Black independent institutions during these global Black arts movements. So our charge comes from the Grand Master, Dr. John Henry Clark, that no people are really free until they become the instruments of their own liberation, and that each generation must take and maintain its freedom with its own hands. That's always been true. It's always going to be true. And we also end with the great forerunner, Dr. Paul Robeson, whose charge to us is that the artist must elect to fight for freedom or slavery. Thank you very much.